Actually, since 2017, 30% of the capacity in this province, since 2017, 30% has of sawmilling capacity alone. We're not talking about plywoods. We're not talking about oak pulp mills, which have also closed down.
Yeah.
30% of sawmill capacity has been eliminated some way or another, either by a shift or by an entire sawmill closure, what have you.
Hello, I'm John Brink, and we are podcasting on the Brink from downtown Prince George, British Columbia. And today, a special podcast in regards to BC forest industry in crisis or in transition, but I believe that we have now gone to the mode that may be a crisis and a very serious one. So this is our fourth episode in regards to the crisis. And today's guest is David Elstone. And David Elstone has been in the industry for about 25 years. He's a registered professional forester, an RPF. He had a graduate diploma business administration from Simon Fraser University. He's a Bachelor of Science in forestry from the University of British Columbia. He is also the managing director of the Spar Tree Group, and they present an interesting document probably every 3 months or so, and that is the view from the stump. And I'm just kind of showing our guest the publication. It is exceptionally well done by David in terms of not only in terms of dialogue, but also in terms of statistics and the things that are happening in the industry. So it is certainly for anybody that is involved in the forest industry, directly, indirectly, highly recommended by me. And I've known David for a long time, and extremely knowledgeable in the field and very up to date. That then being said, David, so the last time we had a podcast between you and me was in April 2023, a little bit more than a year ago, and it was my podcast number 113. Today, a lot of water has gone under the bridge. I did podcasts around the globe, and this one is podcast number 269. And we have people watching not only in British Columbia, but in Canada, the United States, and around the world for that matter. And so the podcast is in particular about the BC forest industry in crisis. So we see more jobs being lost, more mills closing down, and things are not really getting better. In fact, I hear more. Even this morning I heard about some major operations closing for temporary close for a month during the summer to await what is happening in the marketplace and maybe as it relates to policy. So where do you see it? In particular, you did quite a write-up about the situation, and your last publication, April of 2024. And so give us a bit of your view where you see things today in particular.
Sure. Thanks, John, for having me on once again. I think this is my third podcast with you, so it's great to be back. In April 2023, I literally had just walked across the block, so to speak, from the Kofi convention, and I just gave a speech there about what was happening in British Columbia. We're not going back to what it used to be. How do we move forward? And yeah, I think things have definitely gotten worse even since that speech. Unfortunately, it's frustrating. It's not for people trying to not figure, or trying to figure out solutions. There's been lots of effort, but we can't seem to escape this so-called death spiral that are unfortunately the British Columbia forest industry is engaged in. And I think right now we are seeing continued tougher times. I mean, lumber prices started off really nicely this year. They jumped above 400. dollars US per 1,000 board feet for SPF, and they look quite optimistic at the start of the year. I think people in February and May, or February and March, and we're thinking, oh, maybe we've turned a corner. Unfortunately, since April and onwards, it's really gone downhill once again. We're back to well below 400. We're below cash costs of production, and so shockingly, we are stuck at a level that's flatlining around the $380 mark. And when you look forward, at least into the short term, where is that sense of hope? Where is that sense of what can we hang our hat on in terms of what's going to change the market here in North America? But I want to make sure that you understand, and your audience understand, that in British Columbia, what's happening here is not market driven. We're talking about markets just at the moment, and markets do play a factor. But what's happening in British Columbia is not about markets alone, and that's an important thing to note, because it's not about markets here in British Columbia. It's about structural change, policy change. It's about changes that are affecting British Columbia only. And I think that is important to drive home that message, because we can't just sit there and eventually hope that it's going to turn around based on a change in markets.
So that then being said, David, is that, and I agree with you 100%, is that A is the market, and the market is it's sloppy and difficult. It's as you already indicated, around 370, 380, 2x4 random length is usually used as the measure, and that the cost of production, the average cost of production is probably somewhere between 500 and 550. So virtually all the primaries are underwater to different degrees depending on location and the cost of their fiber. And it has been tough already for quite a while. The other problem obviously has been is that and I've been involved in the forest industry since my first job was in a furniture factory in Holland, and when I was 13, so I'm nearly 84. So for nearly 70 years I've been involved in lumber. Came to Canada in July of 1965, started out as a cleanup man, lumber pilot. So I've been involved, and particularly in northern British Columbia, in this region, the Prince George region, for nearly 60 years. Started a value-added company 50 years ago in 1975, and still are operating today with mills in not only Prince George, but Vanderhoof in Houston, and then have a number of other companies. But I have watched the industry closely, always been very, very involved in it, worked for a number of companies before I started my own company, and we used to be, in a period before 2000, we were the lowest cost producers of lumber virtually in the world. We were selling products all over the world, coast in interior mainly in the US, but coast around the world. And things have changed dramatically in the south part, the coast in particular, in early 2000 until now, have gone through a very difficult period, also direct and indirectly relating to forest policy. And then talking about the interior, where most of the forest industry was, up into early 2000, we had in the province of British Columbia 120 sawmills. Today we are less than 60 sawmills, and subsequently, and again, not only coast but also in the interior. Employment used to be in the area of 180,000 people and families having careers in the forest industry, where that number now is approaching 62,000, nearly 120,000 direct jobs have been lost in the forest industry. Multiply that by 3 or 4, the number is staggering. And if I look in northern BC in particular at Fort Nelson, I look at Fort St. John, I look at Chetwynd, I look at Mackenzie, I look at Bear Lake, I look at Fraser Lake,
Certainly.
and on and on and on and on.
Actually, if I done some work in my company, the Spar Tree Group, and reported in View from the Stump, which provides a ground level perspective. Actually, since 2017, 30% of the capacity in this province, since 2017, 30% has of sawmilling capacity alone. We're not talking about plywoods. We're not talking about oak pulp mills, which have also closed down.
Yeah,
30% of sawmill capacity has been eliminated some way or another, either by a shift or by an entire sawmill closure, what have you.
And the likely is more to come unless things change, because as I look now at the annual allowable cut, again, for those people that are not overly familiar with, the annual allowable cut is the amount of fiber that we can harvest to maintain a steady flow of available fiber, has dramatically decreased from where it used to be and you correct me if I'm wrong, in the mid-60s, to where now is around 50, but available fiber due to regulations and other things is well below that, more closely to 40, or even, as people speculate, going to in the 30s.
So, like for the work I do, when I provide perspectives in the View from the Stump newsletter, I try not to focus on the allowable annual cut, which is the amount of timber we're allowed to harvest annually based on biophysical factors and modeling and trying to understand the inventory and constraints on the land base. That's set by the chief forester of the province. That's a theoretical maximum, but rarely do we ever harvest to that level. And what I like to focus on is actual harvest levels. So we're at about 60 million cubic meters of AAC, or allowable annual cut, for the major licenses in this province. But last year we only harvested 32, 35 million, depending if you include waste or not. So we're around half of AAC. But the AAC is going to come down no matter what we do because of the mountain pine beetle. Obviously the mountain pine beetle, fires, and other factors have taken a lot of our timber supply. So I like to look at what the harvest is doing. And the harvest itself has fallen dramatically over the last few years. Some of that was, if you say, look at 2018, 2019, a lot of that was due to the mountain pine beetle, sort of the lagging effects of that epidemic of so many pine trees killed in this province. 54% of the merchantable timber in this province, 54% of the merchantable lodgepole pine in this province was killed by that little insect. Right. But in 2021, we started another steep decline. And I'd say that is not due to the mountain pine beetle, but that's due to other things that are happening in this province. The interesting thing that you may not know, John, is that actually in the last few months, the downward trend is starting to level off a little bit here. We're seeing just some slight improvement in the harvest. Like it is flattening. So to be honest, I think that it's temporary. I think we're still going to see some declines, but we are seeing a little bit of a flattening. Could be in response to earlier this spring's lumber rally that happened, and of course that's over. So now things are going to be retrenching again. But just to point out that there is a little bit of a flattening, and it could take another dip, but just a little bit of a trivial novelty there to mention.
Yeah, is that mainly in the interior, or are you talking about the coast, or are you talking coast and interior? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, just for the people watching us, is that British Columbia is an amazing province with a lot of forest lands, nearly 22 million hectares, but the coast is the different species in the coast between Douglas fir, cedar, and hemble are different species and usually cater to different markets. But they have gone through a difficult period already for quite a number of years, and a lot of the sawmills or mills have disappeared in that area over that time. And then in the interior, a bit little different is that the pine beetle, it started with the spruce beetle actually in the early 80s, and then the spruce beetle again came back in further north in the McKinsey TSA timber supply area, and then obviously the pine beetle epidemic that substantially put pressure. Initially, it was uplifted the amount of harvest to extract the economic value that would be there, and that then ended 2017, 2018, 19 in that area, and now we are down to a reduced area. So what I hear you saying is that now the other parts that have played a role is fires were bad, in particular in 17, 18, 19, and then the other part that has played a role is UNWRAP, the allocation of land and fiber to First Nations that is somewhere in the area, in some areas different than others, has gone from 12% of the annual allowable cut to as high as 20% of the annual allowable cut. That then puts more pressure on the available fiber for the traditional uses of that fiber of the AAC and regions. And then it becomes a question of what will happen as we go forward in terms of the available AAC, annual allowable cut, and how much of it will be for most of the operators that plan forward, because the industry where you invest a lot of money in a mill traditionally here could cost well in excess of 200 million, 150 million plus is not abnormal for an average size mill. And then it becomes a question of accessibility to fiber. And so mills have to be able to plan ahead for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years as to where's the available fiber.
Certainly, so accessibility of fiber is the key issue right now in this province. I saw Canfor's announcement. Canfor last year, first of all, it announced the closure of the Houston sawmill, and one of the largest when it was built back in 2007 or refurbished, and the final version there in 2007 was one of the largest, if not the largest sawmill in the world. And unfortunately, since then, Canfor, I'm not speaking on behalf of them, but obviously they looked at the runway ahead for success of that investment and said, accessibility of fiber is a huge issue. Like they don't see conditions improving enough to warrant the investment in that sawmill. And so they not only did they cancel that investment, they changed a 6-month indefinite closure on their Polar sawmill that started in January to a permanent closure. And of course, that resulted in the Northwood pulp mill shutting down one line there in Prince George as well. So we're talking, people are not seeing where the fiber accessibility of fiber is going to happen. It's not that we don't have fiber. That may be very clear. We have lots and lots of trees in this province. I just drove across this province the other day, just literally at the beginning of the month or beginning of May, and there's lots of trees. In fact, there's lots of lodgepole pine, even as well. It's coming up now, getting up to that age of maturity, or at least merchantability, I should say. But we're not able to access that fiber for various reasons. And one of the short-term issues is permit.
And just to make sure we explain that then, David, is that I agree with what you say, that in order to have a viable industry of all the elements that are part of it, be it pulp mills, be it plywood plants, be it pellet plants, be it value-added manufacturers. We all rely on each other. You must have all of those elements to have a successful industry. But there is a lot of capital involved in investment in building mills, so you have to have a reasonable expectation of access to fiber. Reasonable means that the fiber is available, that it doesn't disappear, that from an investment perspective, and a lot of our companies are the larger companies like Canfor, Fraser, or the other ones that are public companies. And if you're on the CEO of a company like that and you make recommendations to the board, then you have to have representations to justify capital investment that you can support with reasonable expectations of access to fiber. If you don't have it, nobody's going to give you any money for capital investment, and that's obviously where we are now. And then the other part about it is that we have gone from being, at one point, we were the lowest cost producers of products and shipping to the global market. We've gone to the highest cost producers. And then add to that the other ones of bureaucracy and government is that, and you were referring to that earlier, that if I'm a primary manufacturer, I need to plan ahead in terms of getting what they call cutting permits or logging forest permits for logging in the future getting forward, so we can develop infrastructure like roads and all the other things surrounding that, so that we can look forward and saying, okay, our plan next 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, 3 years from now is moving in that direction, doing this, that, and the other thing. We don't have that now because of other circumstances that where government and other things that have happened of the distribution of the annual allowable cut and access to forest. And I'm supporting of UNWRAP, where First Nations got access to land and resources and fiber and need to give consent. But it has now gone to the point where we have governments, first thinking about provincial governments. Every 4 years we have elections. Then we go to the right or to the left. We have another one coming up on October the 19th. And then we have a Ministry of Forest and all the senior bureaucrats that usually go with that. And then if they have a new Minister of Forest after 4 years, then usually in midterm, every 2 years, they change the Minister of Forest and the Deputy Minister. And so there is no consistency, in my opinion, to the longer term in terms of what can capital and entrepreneurship in communities and other investors, because still, not so much now maybe, but still for the longest time, even now still can be, the forest industry is the economic driver of the province of British Columbia. That's the way it always used to be. It's starting to disappear, and that's extremely troubling. And if we at the same time we look at opportunities that capital, like the major companies, in particular public companies, but also private companies, have to look at other areas to invest. May that be the U.S. Southeast, or may it be Finland, or Sweden, or Europe, or wherever. And so we are at a crisis point, and and even to the point, and all the years I've been here for 60 years, I see all around me those communities and people that are losing their jobs, and there is no, at this point, although things are stabilizing maybe a little bit in terms of access to fiber and the volume available, but still it's not happening. There is still more concerns about further closures of sawmills,
Sure.
or at least shuts. So and it doesn't have to be that way, David. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Where lies the problem? And I say it substantially lies with the politicians of the province.
Well, I mean, of course, it's always easy to blame the politicians and so just to take a different tack here, I think in many respects, the NDP government, which has been in power since 2017, they should be given credit for actually opening up the doors on many discussions that were likely needed to happen. We were talking about old growth. They opened up the door on that big time. Talk about value added. They definitely.
I don't agree with you, David.
I think they did. They opened up the
Yeah.
door. I'm
Yeah.
saying they opened up the door discussions. They opened the door to advance the discussions on First Nations and economic reconciliation. Not to say that other governments wouldn't, but they did open the doors. What they haven't done is haven't walked down, open through the path to backfill the conversations that they've started.
Let me put another spin on that, because I was there, involved in all the meetings and all the involvement in that. I was the vice chair of COFI, actually, until I resigned because I had differences of opinions on where should we go in the future. But old growth, I respect that, and so do most people. And when we talk about old growth, these beautiful big trees that, especially down the coast, but also in some locations in the interior, should be preserved. I support that, and so do most people in the province. But we already have 11 million hectares of old growth down the coast, and we have keep adding to it, which is great. The only thing is when one of the issues was under the intentions paper was that to have more involvement of First Nation. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then in terms of old growth is to again support preserving of old growth, but it went too far. We had a structure of 5 individuals, I believe, and 3 of them were enviros, and 2 of them were RPFs, or people that were involved in the industry, and it went too far. We have now, in a lot of cases, like in the interior alone, we find that log stands that are this size, and if they are over 150 years old, they are designated to be old growth, and it has crippled in a lot of ways, designating cutting permits that may have old growth implications of some sort or another.
Sure.
So I don't think that most people agree with you that, and so did I, because when the government, then John Oregon, and made the announcement, I was the only one from industry that spoke to it in supporting it. I support that because of UNWRAP, which we supported for First Nations being more involved. I support that, and they should be more involved. I support old growth, but it did go too far. And then in terms of including value-added manufacturing, I've been involved in value-added for 70 years. I started in a furniture factory in Holland, and here in Canada for 50 years, and so there is huge opportunity in further manufacturing. We have this beautiful fiber, but we are not utilizing, and government became involved in trying to promote it, and what they did is just the opposite. And so I'm not here to beat up on government, but NDP doesn't have the exclusive on poor management of the forest. It also apply to the BC United, or whatever they call them today, that if we have forest policy, in my opinion, David, and as an investor that has a lot of money invested in the value-added sector, but also in the lumber industry in a general sense, I support primary manufacturing. We cannot be successful as secondaries unless there's a healthy primary sector. But we have to look at the long term in terms of that. There has to be continuity for communities, and there has to be access to fiber. If I compare ourselves to Sweden, that went through the same things as we do, are much more successful in terms of growing volume per hectare than we do. And although we're planting enough trees, we should do more in terms of intensive forestry. That lays the foundation for the future, and then start building on, again, creating that confidence by investors in entrepreneurship and investing in Canada and British Columbia in particular in the industry. And we are not there. We're looking for opportunity, and
So
I say that lies by government or the incumbent government in terms
yeah.
of policy.
So like I say, the government, the NDP government was successful, I think, in opening the door for the conversations to happen. I think that they what they haven't done and what is needed in terms of speaking to investor confidence, etc., is having that follow through. The follow through to show where the actual, not just to say, hey, we want to protect rural growth, or hey, we want to have greater participation by First Nations. But what does it actually mean? Where do we go? What are the consequences? What are the costs? What are the opportunities? Having the actual the actual roadmap to getting there, and go. How do we go through this transition so that we can maintain that investor confidence and people understand what it actually means when we're going down these paths. And we've had a fulsome discussion of the, like I say, the costs and benefits, and we never did any analysis on what would be the impacts of old growth deferrals. They just didn't went and did it. So we decimated the BCTS harvest, literally, and that's one of the reasons why we're seeing some of the troubles in the BC interior now, because that BCTS harvest is down by so much. So we need a roadmap, a vision that is fulsome, a strategy, an economic strategy for this province.
And it has to be, since First Nations, and I support it, UNRAP, I support that, will be very much part of. Now we have the BC government, you and me, that control 95% or more of the timber in the province of British Columbia, together with First Nations. But it's not just First Nations. There are 206 nations, and the two of them together is 207. And they are all overlapping in different regions, all have differences of opinion about what should be harvested and what shouldn't, or what is priority in certain areas. And I don't disagree with that, but it takes away from predictability and industry of all sorts. Medium-sized like me, large companies like the Canforce and West Fraser and all the other big companies, they have to have predictability of where do we go from here, because the way I see it up to now, it is still hopefully declining, but there is still too much capacity, not enough predictable access to fiber.
So John, here's a question for you. Given your length of history and experience in this province, has maybe the industry had it, and I say this with quotes, relatively too easy in terms of looking back at the past, and it's hard. We always tend to, as humans, look backwards and say, "Oh, if only we could be back then," but we're not going back there.
No,
we're going forward with the requirement for greater community involvement, greater First Nations direction. What do you think? Do we need to return to the past, or what do we need to do?
No question. And I like the question, David, because I say absolutely not. It was too easy before. A lot of times we will not go back there. The first thing that we have to do is make sure that we tend to the renewable forest. Do we plant enough trees? And I say, and I had Rob Schutz on my podcast here a couple of weeks ago, and other people. Yes, we are. Okay, that then being said, are we tending to it as well as we can to stimulate the volume per hectare? No, we can put more value, more investment in the land base so that we get a higher return in terms of harvest per hectare. That's good. Then in terms of tenure, I don't believe in tenure, but if we talk about tenure, meaning renewable forest access or for a volume of timber forever and ever, more or less, then I don't agree with that the way it is, the concept of it. And then the other part I don't agree is volume-based tenures. I believe it should, if there is tenure, it should be area-based, because if you have a land base where you're growing products and you tend to it and you make it grow, but you have no reasonable expectation of benefiting from your efforts, then likely it will not happen. Why would you want to invest? That's the other part that I believe is important. And the other part is important, and I said that when I spoke to the intentions paper, which was First Nations and then old growth and value-added sector. I said the future, as I see it, that the primary sector will become smaller, the industry will be more on a regional basis, potency, and certain regions where the lumber will be manufactured in the region where it is harvested. The mills will be smaller, not the big super mills, but smaller. And then there will be more technology involved, more robotics. They will employ less people. And I call that innovative primary in combination with intensive secondary. Intensive secondary is operations like me and others where we've been in value-added manufacturing for 50 years, operate even today when others don't, and employ close to 400 people. And I say it should be either primaries that are doing more value-added manufacturing or working in strategic relationships with others or independents. That's where I think it should go.
I think we can finesse that vision some more, but when you look at the cost structure today, and you look at your vision, do you think we'll have a higher or lower cost structure going forward based on your vision? And just to answer that question, then I got a follow-up question to that will spur some interesting discussion.
Part of the cost structure that is a problem, in my opinion, David, is that the bureaucracy around the government and including the Ministry of Forest has been inflated to the extent that I believe it is at least, and I just throw a number out there, 1/3, 35% too high from what it should be. And if I look at, so that is the one. And then the other part that is in terms of cost, duties, softwood lumber duties, we should be addressed that issue in terms of the underlying reasons that there is a duty that is now moving up to, in some cases, 18% starting in August.
Yeah, so unfortunately the softwood lumber agreement is an international agreement, which means we only have so much say in it as a province, although we are the dominant province. Well, we used to be. Actually, we've come down in our prominence in terms of where we are in relation to other provinces. But we can't. That's going to be that's going to be another main driver where we're going to experience some more downslide to our sector here in British Columbia. Right. But that will also be across Canada. But that you said you think we should be a 1/3 lower cost than where we are today. Now, here's my follow-up question that I said I'd ask. Do you think when government started talking about increased value-added manufacturing, and do you interpret from their perspective that do they understand what value-added manufacturing is? Because I thought when I was listening to them originally speak, Junior Horgan, etc., then the value-added would help cover the cost of a higher cost structure because you're getting more value for the wood that you're selling. Is that a correct interpretation of value-added?
Well, yes, it is and it isn't. Is that basically what we're doing? What is value added? Some people would argue, and I obviously was involved in all the negotiations, both with my head on as a COFI vice chair, and then I always said every time I go into those meetings, I said, I'm not here as the vice chair of COFI, I'm here as a value-added manufacturer, meaning value-added, meaning lumber, not the residuals. And somebody would then argue and say, well, if you put a saw in a tree, that's already value added. So So that obviously value added in terms of what I'm talking about is that the residuals that go into pulp mills, pellet plants, and plywood and all the other things. That's a form of value added manufacturing. If I look at the Gore Brothers mill in West Bank that do mainly boards, that is a good example of integrated primary and secondary manufacturing, a perfect example, an amazing entrepreneurship on the part of that company. If I look at making 2x4s, and then cranking it out by the volumes and volumes, regardless if the market wants them or not, be putting them out. I think the fiber that we have, and as you well know, is a beautiful quality, equal to, if not better than, what we used to import when I worked in Holland from Sweden. And to put it just into 2x4, 2x6, 2x8, 2x10, blah, 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 I say that at least 25% of the lumber that would be manufactured in the new model that I see, innovative primary, 25% or 50% of it, 25% of the upper part, 25% of the lower part would go up the value chain. That's how I see it.
And I want to be clear that, just because you're getting more dollar value because you're actually spending more expenses to make that product into that value-added product, doesn't necessarily mean that your cost structure, should not be a driver of value-added. You should be doing value-added because through a little bit of expenditure, which you have to do to make it into a new product, you're able to eke out some more margin. But that margin shouldn't be going backwards to pay for the costs.
Let me give you an example, David. I lived this for 50 years, worked, pulled it out of the ground, fighting against industry that really didn't care about our government, that say they care about it, but they really didn't. I never got a nickel, not a nickel from government. I don't want it. I've been we employ 400 people. We don't cut one single tree. Not one. I'm paying duty, and is because the government of BC in particular should have been much more. And I was involved in the negotiations on softwood lumber when I was the founding president of the BC Council of Value Added Wood Processors. 800 companies, 8 associations. 25% of them is left. The rest is gone. And so we used to negotiate that if we pay duties on the allegation that timber is subsidized, and I always said the Americans have the right argument for the wrong reason, because they were trying to push up their prices. The harder they make it under competition, the higher their cost or price goes, is that then we used to pay duty on the input, not on the added value added. And so, but government did no longer negotiate that as part of the agreement. And in fact, the BC, COFIO is quite involved in it, but that's a whole different issue. But, so therefore, if we wonder why don't we have more value added, that's one of the reasons, is that, that if you're a value added manufacturer, if you don't get subsidized, you don't take money from the government, that you still get penalized with duties for those particular reasons. And so that's what discouraged investment in value-added manufacturing. But we are one of the largest survivor so far, anyway.
Well, it's just it's a challenging subject because here you're trying to make space for value-added, but there's all these pressures from so many different angles.
So the other thing that we're doing, David, just to put it into perspective, is that all the low-grade lumber that could be further manufactured is being dumped in China at prices lower than it could be sold in BC. But again, those are different issues. But I'm saying there is a place for value-added manufacturing by the independent sector, but also by the primaries. And some of them have done that. Gorman is a good example. And to a certain extent, Galesnikov, who's also a 10-year holder and has done very, very well on value-added manufacturing.
Yeah, definitely Klesnikoff and lumber is a shining example in terms of pushing the envelope on a mass timber production. They've gone from being a lumber producer, a primary producer, to vertically integrating into starting to build their third line on mass timber production in
And
this province.
and that is great, right? So, but being a 10-year holder helps if you have access
Exactly. Well,
to
that is the key. Not They have access to fiber, not being a tenure holder, but they have access to fiber, and that's why we don't see as much mass timber manufacturing or value added manufacturing. It's definitely a huge component. Is just the access to fiber part of that equation is not very strong for many other others that want to expand value added manufacturing.
right. So suffice to say that the industry is all the elements are individually important to each other. The existing primary manufacturers, the larger companies, are critical to the foundation of our forest industry in the province of British Columbia, in particular the north. And and then looking at for every 5 sawmills that go down or have gone down, then it usually is the supply for one pulp mill, and so we can see even more curtailments there as we go forward, and at least in my opinion, because there are still pressures, especially west of Prince George on the west side, still not enough available AAC. Doesn't mean that the AAC is not dead, but the available AAC. The other part that we are trying to do as value-added company is in particular looking at mills that are dormant or no longer operating. We're looking to work with First Nations and to, rather than the mill being torn down, as usually happens, and then being sold in the United States, we're looking at purchasing one of those existing mills without the timber and working with First Nations and saying, let's combine a value-added manufacturer together with First Nations by a mill. Poland is a good example. We would be interested in that, especially if they tear it down and then sell it to somebody in Alabama or wherever, rather than doing that. Leave it sit, and then we would work with First Nations and acquire the asset, and then then do a number of things. Get First Nations involved, a value-added manufacturer like myself, been here for 50 years and obviously have done something right, and then that knows the primary sector, and it would create a new piece, a new model.
Yeah,
we're not looking for tenure. We're not looking for tenure. Simply the First Nations would have the access to the tenure. We would pay them market price in a new co. We would pay First Nations, whoever the group would be, we would pay them market price for the timber. We would employ their people, whoever wanted to work, in the operation, and then we would have the ideal model of a value-added manufacturer that would add. We already have a capital project of building a building for it, actually, on a new value-added mass timber plant and employing 150 people. We would restart the Poland operation that used to have 180, say 200 people, 350 people, multiplied is 3 or 4, close to between 12 and 1,500 people would be employed.
Mm-hmm.
And we would do that, go in that direction. That to me is a new potential model where First Nations doesn't have the timber and just sells it to the market, but gets involved in manufacturing together with a successful value-added manufacturer. And so if that does not happen, or there is not structural direction change, then what would happen is that I believe where we are going right now, there is no, and I try to be an optimist, that's why I say this proposal, is that if we go further, then we will even further reduce the primary capacity that we now have because for lack of certainty, and First Nations may have a lot of the timber, but they have no more place to sell it to
Mhm.
because everybody's gone.
So,
So what
John,
I'm saying, it's a new
yeah.
direction.
No, this is you're not alone in that thought. It's something that I've been writing about for a couple of years now. Is First Nations will be moving beyond the holding of tenure. Tenure is not, in many areas, is not a ticket to make money. It is. It definitely you need to have somewhere to place that timber that you're harvesting. And so it is concerning that there is a collapse in the industry at the moment because a lot of First Nations, I think, are going, well, hey, we have this tenure, we've just acquired it, but the market and the industry is collapsing. That's not good. So what can we do about it? And I think a lot of First Nations are looking at ways to try and add margin, trying to go further down that value chain of where to place that timber. I think you're going to see a lot of innovation coming forward in that space, and I think eventually, I think British Columbia, just like they try to say in the LNG space, that LNG is First Nations LNG or Indigenous LNG, and you're going to say forestry in British Columbia is First Nations forestry because First Nations are leading the conversations. I just attended the BC First Nations Forestry Council. So much positivity there and opportunity.
I I agree with that, David. But what you need is capital. And you need entrepreneurship. You need people that know, and I say that respectfully, but you need people that have expertise in knowing what they are doing. You cannot just
100%.
have a lot of timber and say, I'm going to build a
Yeah.
sawmill and I'm going to do this, and then, yeah, right, try it. So
There's no shortage of capital in this province. If there's it or in the world, if there is opportunity, which right now, what basically this conversation is about, is if does this opportunity exist or not. And right now, we see the potential, but the crisis we're facing today suggests that opportunity doesn't exist because of the structural changes and uncertainty that persists. But that capital will flood into this province once we can demonstrate the opportunity.
yeah, and so that's where we are. And
We've just
that's
come a
what
full
I'm
circle.
saying, is saying that, well, not quite, saying that obviously there has to be, you already pointed it out, maybe the industry had it too easy. You had to be, we have so much timber in this province that, that it would take genius to run out of enough timber. Well, we nearly did. Our available timber is the message. And obviously, that's the issues that we are raising. All right.
So John, setting up the conditions for success. You have often talked on our past conversations about, in 90 years we're going to have so much wood we're not going to know what to do with it.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm going to say that you're wrong, only because I think we could actually be there a lot sooner than 90 years.
I usually say 50, 60 years, but
Oh, okay.
what
Well,
about the
I'm saying
time that it takes to grow?
we could even be there sooner. I think with what I would do with View from the Stump in my newsletter is I try to provide ground level perspectives, but I also try to push discussion on issues. I also like to dispel misunderstandings, and including myself, and learning. I did for myself and learning what I see out there and dispelling my own preconceived notions. I just spent a week traveling around Prince George. I was shocked to see how much lodgepole pine there was.
Yeah.
I just looked in the Bowen Lakes watershed. Holy cow! There's trees there that are big and ready to be harvested in terms of commercial thinning. And I think commercial thinning is we're on the cusp of a revolution here in terms of where we're going to go with commercial thinning in this province.
Exactly. And I agree with you 100%, David. I had a little sawmill in the Bowen, as you likely know, at the time of the beetle kill there, and was cutting the wood that nobody else wanted. And then now I go back, and it used to be referred to as the biggest clearing and you could see it all the way from the sky, obviously, but exceeded by the lodgepole pine. But if you now go back, and I go back frequently, actually, and you cannot believe what has happened to the Bowron region and the forest there that was replanted in the early 80s, nearly 40 years ago, and already it's getting close to the area where it can be reharvested. So I agree with you 100%, is that if you have intensive forestry, we will grow the forest even quicker. And there is opportunity. I agree with you there too. But
Yeah, I think
policy is critically important, though.
we have to set the stage for that to happen. I think, of course, I know where number four our fourth podcast is going to happen. It's going to happen in the field in the Bowron Lakes, and we're going to go look at some stands. But I think we have to set up the conditions that I was shocked when I went out with a friend of mine who's a logger and the largest commercial thinner operator in this province. He was showing me what they're able to harvest as a commercial thinning operation, and how and still be economically viable. It was as a guy that's from the coast, as used to higher merchantability standards, bigger diameter trees. It was amazing, and I think these conversations are going to start growing and growing, and there's a convergence of issues. We have Indigenous participation and perspective on how to manage. We have the industry's need for fiber. We have also what we haven't talked about today is wildfire. How we're going to manage for wildfire, and thinning and fuel mitigation treatments are all part of that conversation. So we have a convergence of these issues, and I'm excited about the future in that regard. Actually, we just have to make sure we're setting the table, so to speak, to make sure that these things can happen.
And I am too, and that's why I say even now that I see opportunity and I see First Nations becoming more involved. I say, okay, join with me, and value-added manufacture. We'll get a primary facility that otherwise would be taken down, sent to the States in pieces, and we'll start manufacturing and involvement of First Nation, and that is in the direction of being an optimist. Things will get better, and we have to go through this, and but at the same time, we have to be realistic and recognize some of the areas that are troubling, like getting permits for cutting permits is critically important for the existing infrastructure that we still have in terms of primary facilities. We don't want to see us losing more of them, although there is a danger that that may happen. And so us being vocal about it, between yourself, myself, David, Russell, and as well as Rob Schutz, is very important to talk about the issues. David,
Certainly.
Anything else that comes to mind? We have had a full hour of discussion. I'm an optimist. I always say, I fly around a lot because we have a place in Victoria. And I always sit by the window and I look outside, I say, it's paradise. It is paradise. And I do the same as you do. See all that timber there and saying, what an unbelievable province we have,
There is no shortage of trees, and I think we've got to just set the date. We're going to go for our next podcast. We're going to the field and we're going to go look at the Bowron Lakes. I think that's what we're going to do.
I like it, and I'll show you where a sawmill used to be.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
My pleasure to be here.
Thanks, David. You take care. Bye-bye.